if we think that we got it right and we're not humbly assuming that potentially we're misreading the spirits, then we will end up running roughshod over others.
You are listening to Practice Not Perfect, a podcast on practice, which is rooted in the Christian spiritual tradition. I am your host, James Matichuk. Spiritual discernment in the Christian sense is the process by which we learn to attend to God's presence and God's leading in our lives as we grow in our relationship with God. But how do we actually practice discernment? And why is it sometimes so hard? Are there things that get in the way of our discerning the spirits? And what are the limits of what we should expect? I got to sit down with Adam Shields, a fellow book nerd and spiritual director, to discuss some of our concerns and convictions about spiritual discernment. Neither of us claims to be an expert on discernment, but both of us seek to grow in our capacity to discern well. Here is our conversation. Hi, everybody. I am here with my friend Adam Shields. He is somebody I've known online for a decade. We're both book bloggers at one point in time. Adam still is at Bookwi.se. And we are also both spiritual directors. I think you did your spiritual direction program like a year or two before I did. And you are a practicing spiritual director and a consultant for churches, and you've done ministry for a number of years as well. And I thought, based on some recent research and things that you've been posting on social media, that it would be good if we could have a conversation around discernment. That's a topic you've been exploring. Obviously, as a spiritual director, people come to you when they are trying to discern something. So that is kind of your wheelhouse in one sense, but also you and I are both students of the spiritual life, and I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on discernment, and you were keen to stress that you're not an expert to me when I posed this conversation, but we're eager to learn. And I can point to my life and places where that I had very poor discernment, and only really kind of became aware of that in hindsight. So, but before we get into that conversation, I like to begin with my practice questions. So the first question that I always pose to people is, what is one thing you have practiced a lot of? And this could be anything. It could be a sport you played, an instrument you learned, a skill you mastered. What is one thing you've practiced?
You brought up books. So books is like the thing that I have practiced more than probably anything else. I very much remember moving to a new school, and at the end of first grade, early second grade, I'm not sure. I moved at the end of first grade, but I don't remember whether it was at the end of first or early second. I went to the library of this tiny rural school. They didn't have a principal. It was such a small school. And I think that it must have been a volunteer librarian in what was a large closet of a library. But she wouldn't let me check out books that were the ones that I wanted to check out. And I was just so indignant about the fact that I can read this book. Why aren't you letting me have it? And so I think I basically rage checked out books from the library, the public library, which was all of 40 feet from my house. And so went and just started reading everything in the library. And that's what I had pretty much done for the rest of my life, is just read everything that I have access to and am interested in. And then you commented about book blogging, but around 2009, a friend of mine suggested I start a blog. And so I did. And I have basically blogged almost every book that I've read since 2009. So I'm up over 2,000 that I have written about. And that practice of reading and thinking about it and then putting it on, digital ink. And then I don't really do it for others as much as it's like a good spiritual practice for me to be able to think about what it is that I read and why I'm reading it and what value it is to me. And then I go back and read them all the time. And it is a somewhat public spiritual practice of reading and thinking about it in public.
I'll say it's interesting because there are blog posts that I did on books that sometimes it's just, I read that book. What did it say? Let me go read what my thoughts were when I read it. And, sometimes, I mean, this, you can read the right book at the wrong time or the wrong book at the right time. And so I've gone back to books and had a different feel about them. But to kind of have kind of that slice of history of what was your process when you encountered that it's been a gift for me too. So my other question is, what's one thing you've practiced in life that you don't practice anymore?
I was a trumpet player in school and started college as a music education major and realized very quickly, was encouraged to realize by my trumpet teacher that I really just wasn't that good. And I was encouraged to transfer out of the music school and into the regular college pretty soon. And the dean of the music school dragged me out an extra semester to stick in, and I probably shouldn't have, but I played trumpet for another year after I left the music school in the wind ensemble, and at some point in time I realized I'm not going to get any better about this. Like, I'm as good as I'm ever going to be, and there are just other things I want to do in life that investing that time in them would bring about more for my long-term enjoyment. And so I put my trumpet down and I basically have just not picked it up again. And I somewhat regret that because I enjoyed playing, but on the other hand, I was never going to get any better than what I was. Like, I was at the absolute peak when I set it down.
Yes.
And I wasn't going to get better.
So randomly, I also played trumpet in high school. And it's a similar thing. Is my daughter played trumpet until this past year. She decided she needed to put it down because of various reasons. But I would like to be able to still play trumpet. But then there's that reality that what you know and what you can do when you haven't played your trumpet and how bad it sounds when you haven't put in the hours. It's just, I can't even pick it up and enjoy it at this point.
Yeah, it is true. The practice matters in all kinds of things. And musical instruments may be just the best example for me, because I've never been good at sports, but musical instruments are the best example to me of it takes effort to even maintain competence.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why I asked the practice question in the beginning, because I think how we practice anything kind of illuminates how we practice everything. So like the spiritual practices or like living out your faith versus, hours you put into something else. There's a similar dynamic in how they work. So we're here to talk about discernment. So I have I like a really basic definition question in the beginning. What is spiritual discernment? As far as we understand.
Yeah. I want to talk about Christian discernment because I think theoretically we can have spiritual discernment that is outside, and I don't want to speak for other people. So I tend to want to talk about Christian discernment, and I come at it with a lot of frustration in how I have read other people and talked to other people about discernment, because it feels to me like most people, when they talk about discernment, mean decision making and just using Christian language for decision making. Like if we just Christianize the language, then suddenly it's more spiritual, and we go forward from there. And there's an aspect of decision making in discernment, but I think that it fundamentally misses the point of historical Christian discernment. That American entrepreneurialism and effectiveness has reduced discernment to decision making, that one aspect, and missed a lot of the rest of what discernment is really about. I think Christian discernment, is fundamentally about following God and seeking after God and orienting ourselves to the journey of what it means to become Christ-like. And as we become Christ-like, there will be aspects of decision-making, there'll be aspects of ethical choice and all kinds of other things around that. But fundamentally, what it means to be discerning is to discern where God is and follow after God in the path that God has intentionally laid out for you based on your createdness as an individual.
Ooh, I love that. That puts it well. I mean, I agree with you in terms of how I've seen discernment talked about, especially I would say I grew up in the evangelical world, and that's kind of first book I read that quote unquote was about discernment that I remember was Decision Making in the Will of God. and it was this, you ask God for wisdom and you make good decisions. That's what it.
And I think it's not even just evangelicalism, although evangelicals do that. But my spiritual direction program was Catholic, and so I read a fair amount of Ignatian books on spiritual discernment, and almost all of them also reduced. And in some ways, I think it's worse that Catholic writers who are intentionally writing about Ignatius reduce it to decision making, because that's not what Ignatius. It's a misreading of his intent in so many ways. So it almost makes me question about whether or not some of these writers actually understand Ignatius.
Yeah, I mean, my reading of Ignatius is where I first encountered his version of discernment was not in the spiritual exercises, which are really hard to read, but his autobiography. And in his autobiography, I mean, everything is reflective. So, like, where was the good spirit? Where was the bad spirit? It's all in looking back at his life as it unfolded and where his sense of consolation and desolation was. So it's almost like it's not about decision making. It's about discerning in reverse and naming reality for what it is as he pursues Christ.
Well, and I think that there's a very important aspect of discernment that is important today that you bring up there, is that for Ignatius, who is a pre-Enlightenment writer, he is acknowledging the enchanted nature of the world, like in the sense that there is a spiritual reality that is beyond just the purely natural. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we need to re-engage with Christian discernment in an intentional sense, is because we live in a disenchanted world and we need to re-enchant it again. Like, if we don't re-enchant it in a Christian way, then it will naturally be re-enchanted in other ways that are not particularly Christian.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the problems within the church, is that people naturally want an enchanted world. And if we resist claiming our heritage of Christian understanding of the spiritual realm, then people will fill it with something else. So we need to fill it with intentionally Christian understanding of what the spiritual world is.
Yeah, you brought this up in our kind of back and forth before this conversation, but Karl Rahner's famous quote is that the future of Christianity will be mystical. And yet there are lots of ways that the whole Christian enterprise is being disenchanted in probably both like the evangelical world and in kind of the mainline, I do a lectionary group every week with mostly mainline clergy. And what they do is just dissect the text in terms of historical critical method. And of course, they do believe in the Spirit and some sense of God, but it does become sort of, I don't know, mechanical in how you do it. So how do we enchant it?
Yeah.
Because there are these critical issues, and we are post-Enlightenment. So we are.
We can't just simply reclaim the pre-Enlightenment understanding of the world. We can't go back.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out a new method. And this is kind of, because we've had some earlier discussion about it, that there's several reasons why I have started this current looking at discernment. But one of them is this very aspect of what does it mean to re-enchant the world?
Yeah. And
so, I've read Richard Beck's Hunting Magic Eels and Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue and Charles Taylor and some, like, all of these people are getting at some aspect of there is an enchanted world out there. And I even the word enchanted is probably the wrong one
sure.
I mean it in a very much a sense of there is a spiritual world that is beyond the natural world.
Yeah.
But if we believe that God is transcendent in some way that can't be limited to the natural, then I think we have to start with maybe it's a measurement problem, like what you measure is real in some sense. And so if we start with the assumption that we're just all natural beings, then that's all we're going to get. But most people have some sense of a transcendent moment. Like we've seen a beautiful vista, we've watched a sunset, we've gone to the ocean, the natural world is where we often understand transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
But we've also had, the birth of a child or those things that just feel like they are bigger than the individual components of them. And so I think that if we name them as enchanted and expect some sense of enchantment from them, then it makes it easier to look back on them and understand the enchantment that was there. Like part of Ignatius understands discernment in part as being a response to whether something is drawing you to God or pushing you away from God. It's kind of an overly simplistic understanding of his consolation and desolation. Sure. But he assumed that there's a natural ebb and flow to the spiritual life. We're going to feel spiritual, we're going to not feel spiritual. That's part of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And his response to that is that when you are in consolation, when you feel spiritual, you need to remember that at some point in time, that's not going to be there. So whenever you're spiritual and feel this transcendence, then you also need to remember some point in time later, I'm going to forget this. I'm going to have doubt. I'm not going to have the same kind of emotional high that goes with it. And so we record, he encourages people to record it so that we can draw upon it later. And the same way, when we are in desolation, when we don't feel the spiritual, we're supposed to go back and read or remember the transcendent feeling that we had.
Yeah.
And I think that matters to the way that we perceive that transcendence exists.
Yeah.
There's some sense of encouragement and cultivation there.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about Mother Teresa in terms of she had that mystical moment of transcendence and then decades of desolation. Mm-hmm. But she could point back to something. It was remembered and it kept her on the path. Even though, she dealt with spiritual darkness for a long time. Not that I necessarily agree with everything Mother Teresa did, but I do think that's.
But there was a transcendent moment there.
Yeah.
That I think is what it matters. I was listening to a podcast with David Brooks and Russell Moore this morning while I was walking my dog, and Russell Moore asked David Brooks, I don't remember the exact prompting of the question, but it was basically he asked something about what drew you to becoming a Christian. And I hadn't heard this from David Brooks before, but he said he was sitting on a subway and he just suddenly felt the transcendent nature of all of the created people around him. Like, these people are all transcendent. They're beyond. He said it wasn't that I understood then that they were made in the image of God, although that's the language that he would say now. But he said, like, they are more than just natural beings. And he said he had, it's the similar kind of thing that Thomas Merton and many others have also had. And he said he didn't know that story until after he became a Christian. About 5 years later, he ran across it. But that sense of, that's what I think that Rahner was meaning, is that if we can't identify that others are made in the image of God, that we are all created beings, that there's some sense of transcendence, then a purely naturalistic religion is just intellectualism. And then that ceases to be Christianity.
Yeah. Part of my work is in a church, and this is the time of year that we do, denominational reports and stuff. And as you were talking, I was thinking, instead of measuring the metrics that churches measure by,
butts and seats, baptisms, and Sunday school attendance.
Yeah. If there was some way to have a metric for transcendent moments in the life of the church, it would be different. I don't know how you would put that in a spreadsheet, but coming back to your reasons for exploring the topic, what brought you to this current exploring of discernment?
So two things happened in quick succession that kind of told me that I needed to pay attention to this. One, in a spiritual direction setting, one of the people that I meet with had a very real thing that they needed to work through. It was a decision-making thing. Mm-hmm. And so in part of because he is a pastor, part of this was a public church sense of discernment. And so we were talking through what it means to teach discernment to others. And I realized I just don't have a good sense of what that is.
Yeah.
But right before that, I was reading a posthumously published book by Henri Nouwen called Discernment. And it was pulled together by some of his students, published about 10 years after he passed away. And in it, he spends a lot of time talking about his discernment process of going to L'Arche, the community. There's many of them around the world, but the one that he went to was in Canada, and outside of Toronto, and he spent time with John Vanier and Thomas Philippe, the founders of L'Arche, when he was at a low point trying to discern whether he should leave Harvard or not. And so he spends a lot of time talking about and meeting with the two of them, especially Thomas Philippe, who was in his 80s, I think, at that point in time. And as he talks about how holy these two men were and how wise and how helpful they were to his spiritual life, it was hard for me to read because I'm aware that the two of them were, I have no idea whether Henri Nouwen knew or had any concept of the fact that they were both involved in basically a sex cult. They were bringing women into spiritual direction and then spiritually manipulating them into sex for decades. And this was a part of a decent sized group of priests and other leaders who were spiritually abusive and sexually abusive of women. And that has been well documented at this point in time. But even in the 1950s, Thomas Philippe was accused of sexual misconduct, and the Catholic Church stripped him of all of his spiritual authority and his ability to act as a priest. And so part of what was disturbing to me was that Henri Nouwen either just didn't know about this, or nobody around him that should have known about this caught it. So in the mid 80s, 30 years after Thomas Philippe was stripped of his priestly role, he's still acting as a spiritual director to a very well-known Catholic priest who's a world-famous author. And Nouwen's writing about it, and nobody's doing anything about it. And so there's this is a discernment process gone wrong. And so I was really disturbed by reading this book because I just know backstory that wasn't in the book. Yeah. And so there are lots of great thoughts in the book, but this was a book that showed me that discernment is a fallible process. It's just not something that is perfect. And I knew that before, but it disturbed me in a way that I really needed to pursue what discernment is as a way to kind of address my disconcernment about Nouwen in this process.
It is interesting because if you could excise that part of Nouwen's story from the book, it's a really good book.
There's many parts of it that are very helpful. But I think that there's also a sense of we are gifted and created as individuals, and our life experience and our created giftings and our proclivities and all of that stuff give us insight into aspects of discernment, but not every aspect of discernment. Like there's just nobody that's going to be perfect. And so I was talking to Hanna Anderson on Twitter, and I mentioned this aspect to it. And she said, I think that Nouwen was particularly gifted in transparency, vulnerability, and guilelessness. And that isn't the kind of person that's going to see corruption and abuse. And so he just didn't see it. And I think that that's right. But that's also, I think, one of Nouwen's weaknesses was that he acted a little bit as a lone ranger, and he didn't have a particular spiritual director. He had a bunch of people that he would meet with on and off. And so he didn't have that trusted person or that trusted group of people that were helping him discern.
Yeah,
I think that we need that because we're naturally we have blind spots, and we have to get someone else to help us see what we don't see.
When I think about this too, though, I mean, now and after he goes to L'Arche, writes some of the most poignant and beautiful books that he writes, that are really steeped in what he learned from John Vanier. What probably you and I both learned from John Vanier is this this belief in the humanity of everyone. You're wearing a shirt right now that says every human is made in the image of God, every single one. And the revelations about Jean Vanier and the fact that he was a sexual predator is kind of shocking, or was shocking to me, because one of the things that I felt like I knew about Jean Vanier was his honoring of people with disabilities and really seeing their image bearing, and yet now, like, I'm sickened by it. I still have a few John Vanier books on the shelf behind me, but I got rid of some because I'm like, I'm never going to look at this again. But I also know that some of them impacted me in a way that was positive. And I don't, like with Henry Nouwen, like, did he discern correctly or not? I don't know, because could he have written in the name of Jesus without going to L'Arche? Who knows? Yeah, I mean, but you're right. It's a fallible process, and the way that it's entangled with this ugliness, I can't sort it out either. So as we've explored it, are there any convictions about discernment that have grown up in you, or things that you've seen particularly helpful?
Yeah, I was sitting down yesterday morning thinking about this. I was trying to, and I ended up with 9 pages of handwritten notes on what I think that I have learned about discernment over the last few months. And some of that is stuff that I've just was reconfirmation.
Yeah.
But some of it I think was new. So, we've already said that discernment fundamentally is process oriented, not a event oriented or decision making oriented thing.
Mm-hmm.
We've already talked about the transcendent nature and why I think that that's important. I think that another part of it is that that this is somewhat different from just discernment, but I'm increasingly convinced that part of why we're at the state where we're in right now as a American church is that we took the tools of media and used them for evangelism. And so we did mass evangelism. And then we thought that that was successful because it seemed efficient. And then we turned to mass discipleship. Mm. And so there just is no way to teach or do discernment on a mass scale. Like, it's a small scale discussion oriented, life lived together kind of thing. You just can't say because one person was discerned that they should take a job as a pastor, that the next person should also take that same discernment process and come to the same result. It just isn't what, we have different giftings, temperaments, and created realities. And so we will come to differences of discernment. And part of the mass discipleship orientation means that to do mass discipleship, you have to come to the same result. Like it's a process, it's structure. Like there's a flow chart that you fill in answer A with B, because that's the only way that it can be done to a large group of people at the same time. And discernment fundamentally is opposed to that because it can't have the same answer all the time.
Right.
That's not to say there's no truth or like any of those things. It's just to say that God directs us to become who we are, not to become somebody else. Like James Martin has a book, Becoming Who You Are, about Now and Thomas Merton. And it's a great little book about them trying to be other people before they became who God intended them to be. And it's not particularly about discernment, but I think that's the right result of that book, is to understand that there's a particularity to who we are. And we can't teach discernment or be discerning if we don't allow for differences of result. And so that's one of my big takeaways recently, is that we have to create systems that allow for difference and different result. And if we can't do that, we can't actually be discerning.
Yeah. I think the spiritual direction question that we always come back to is like, where is God? where did you see God in that moment? And that is the discernment question, in the sense of when I think about this, it's discernment in one sense is about seeing reality for all that it is. And that's widen the perspective to see things through, the rhythms of where the spirit is moving and things that we naturally don't know to pay attention to unless somebody prods us in the right direction. So, and that's not a mass process, because if you're asking on a individual level, then it is there could be very different answers in very different ways that is lived out.
Well, God doesn't make cookie cutters. And that's just like mass discipleship requires cookie cutters, and that's
well, and going back to my earlier comment, you can't put transcendent moments on a spreadsheet, because that's not how it works. When you measure it can't be in that way.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about beforehand, but what do you think some of the obstacles are to discernment?
I think the biggest one that we have to assume is that it's a fallible process.
Yeah.
And related to that, the biggest problem is to think that we got it right. If we think that we got it right, and we're not humbly assuming that potentially we're misreading the spirits, then we will end up running roughshod over others. Like there's the classic college story of the guy who comes up to a girl and says, God told me that I'm going to marry you. Like, that is a classic bad discernment moment of when you tell others that God has told you what they're going to do, then that is a classic potential for abusive spiritual relationships. And so there's a very real problem of a lack of humility and a lack of assumption that we just might have it wrong. So I think that we always have to start with the assumption that we may have it wrong. And even if we think that we have it right just then, doesn't mean that there's a permanent directional line. Like, as a personal, I had when I was in college, I had a mentor pray over me and said, you have been called to Chicago and you need to just stay there. And I took that very seriously. And I don't think that it was a wrong thing to take that seriously at the time. But I didn't have a sense of that may be for just a period of time. Because I've 10 years later, 12 years later, I had a very clear sense of, I'm supposed to leave. And so I think one of the problems of discernment is that we may think that because something is true today means that it will be true forever. And that's just not always the case. Like, it's not that we're getting it wrong. It's that discernment can be for a season.
Yeah. And, just that story calls to mind, I think, because we've said that, you can't do discernment apart from community. However, community itself can be an impediment to discernment.
Absolutely. And
I think of, there is these controlling religious environments that, that there may be things that you're not allowed to think or consider or in that setting. And somehow, you have to have a different community if you're going to move beyond. And that is a scary process. And also, you do need people that you're accountable to and that you're somehow yoked with, in order to be able to discern that faithfully. And, it's messy.
Right. Well, and just as individually, you as an individual are not always going to be right at discernment, you as a part of a community are also not going to always be right as discernment. And there are times when we're going to be called away and to do something different and to leave this community. And at least there may be. I think there's a couple other limitations to it that you may or may not have read Lauren Winner's book, The Dangers of Christian Practice. But I think is a good book on reminding us that no Christian practice is without problems because they can be all misused. And she writes about prayer and Eucharist primarily, and one of the main things in her prayer chapter is about a widowed woman who keeps all of these prayer journals and faithfully writes out her prayers. And so we can find all about her piety and the way that she prays. And she is a antebellum slave owner who prays for death of slaves and for punishment to slaves, and that you would have a different heaven than the slaves and the abolitionists have. And it's just a reminder that just because we have a spiritual practice, that spiritual practice isn't going to always be used correctly.
Right, right. Theoretically, it shouldn't work that way. I mean, if our practice is about opening ourselves up to God, it shouldn't just reinforce the status quo that is in us, but it does sometimes.
Right. Well, I know that there are responses to this for natural theology, but my main opposition to natural theology is that traditionally the way that it has been practiced is confirmation of prior cultural bias.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's just the reality of discernment as well, is that without some kind of brake system, the natural bias for our discernment will be our current cultural bias. And whatever that may be, like, whether it's about race or gender or economics or political or, any of those things, our tendency is going to be to do and follow whatever is the natural cultural bias at the time. And that may not be what God really wants. So that is a natural place where we should be wary of discernment, is if it just encourages us to continue in the natural cultural bias of what's around us.
Yeah. So you bring up an interesting point with this, and maybe I want to talk a little bit about deconstruction, but like, if our understanding of the universe and God and everything in it is somehow contingent on our culture and our community, when things shift for us, the ground shifts. So if people have a faith shift or they deconstruct in some way, I think sometimes that goes from, I'm in a controlling religious environment, and this is what faithfulness looks like, and these are the behaviors that are appropriate and allowed, to, okay, there was something wrong there, and now I'm in the world and all options are open to me, and yet that is not always healthy. So I don't know, how would discernment help us through a process like that?
I think that there's several, like, again, I can't talk without referencing a book. It's just how I think about the world, is that I reference a book. So Laura Anderson has a recent book on recovering from religious harm, and she's particularly writing about high control religious communities and the kind of harm that those high control religious communities can do to people in them. But what I didn't expect from the book that I found really helpful, and frankly, it was a point of confirmation for me, in a transcendent kind of way, is that she pointed out that many people who are in high control religious communities are there for two reasons. These aren't the only two, but the two that really stuck out to me are people who lived a licentious life before they became a Christian, and they want to keep their families or others from the harm that they experienced. And so as a means of doing that, they pendulum swing to this high control system that they think will solve the problem of the licentious life that they lived beforehand. And so people who are leaving those high control can have that same pendulum swing in the opposite direction. And so her writing gave me a sense of, like, there's good intent even if there's bad process there.
Mm-hmm.
The second group of people that I think that she suggested are drawn to high control religious communities are people who have been traumatized in some sense, and they just don't have the emotional capacity to deal with their trauma and to make all the decisions they have to make to live in the world. And
Mm.
so they move into these high control communities in order to pre-make a lot of decisions for themselves so that they can just function.
Right.
And again, both of those gave me a lot more empathy to people who are drawn to high control. I'm not drawn to a high control. Like, I'm an anti-control
Sure. Me too.
person.
Yeah.
But I have a lot more empathy for why people may be drawn to those high control. So that's the wrong answer. It's the wrong direction to your question. But because because that helped me have a greater understanding for why people might be drawn to high control, I think that it gives us some insight on people who are running away from some of those high control backgrounds too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the high control harmed them, and so they're trying to leave to get away from the thing that harmed them, just as some of the others were drawn to the high control as a way to solve them. And I don't come down on the same place where Laura Anderson does in all of her kind of therapeutic work on how to help people come out of high control. But I do think that she has some of it right, that she knows that people no longer have a system of understanding how the world works. And so they have to recreate a new system of how the world works. Mm-hmm. And that's just a hard and emotionally taxing thing. And part of the problem is that almost always they're doing it by themselves. Yeah. Because the very nature of deconversion or deconstruction or leaving a community means that you lost the people that you turned to.
Yeah.
And so part of what she suggests is don't jump out into everything is good. Like, so what I would suggest, and this is just way easier said than done, is that, Hanna Anderson's book on discernment is
great book.
Whatever is good. It's a great book, but her primary focus is helping people think about what is good, that we are drawn to, and not sin avoidance.
Yeah.
And so high control communities are primarily are about sin avoidance, and they haven't figured out how to have the what is good, what is the right reason for believing what we believe. There was a discussion on Twitter recently about a current eternal conscious torment hell, and some of the response to it was, well, if there's no eternally conscious torment hell, then why would I act good? And that shows why we haven't understood what it means to be Christian.
Yeah.
So Hanna Anderson's book is about, like, here's a positive understanding of why we need to be Christian. And so to me, figuring out how it is that we work towards that positive sense avoids the licentiousness.
Yeah.
Or the illicit.
If I could just comment on her book, because what she does is she takes the list from Philippians, whatever is good, whatever honorable. I'm going to not remember all of things, but and uses that to explore what is the good that we're moving towards. And I think if you look in the history of the literature on discernment, that's kind of where a lot of it leads. Maybe not in terms of that scripture, but think of the Desert Fathers and the Benedictines would talk about the virtues, and the list of vices, but these weren't seen as just like things to avoid, but things that are in you that you need to be aware of as you pursue virtue. The Franciscans, not systemized on discernment so much, but like there's this sense of like, what does it mean to move toward love? And so it is kind of the bigger picture, and people in deconstruction need to also know that as a movement, and some of it is becoming self-aware of what's going in you, or what's going on inside you, and we're all in need of that. So sorry to interrupt, but just
no,
yeah,
like that's exactly. I think that there's weaknesses to Hanna's book, but she does what she's leaning into really well. Yeah. And I think that that's an important part of how it is that we figure out moving forward. And so maybe the second part of where I would say is how discernment can be related to deconstruction is that fundamentally, in my mind, Christianity is a liberatory faith. Like, it should be about freedom. And so I'm resistant to high control religious communities, in part because they're not about freeing people as much as they are about creating boundaries around themselves so that they don't accidentally screw it up.
Yeah.
And that creates harm because the boundaries that keep you from screwing it up are different than the boundaries that keep me from screwing it up. And so what Hanna's work does is help us understand that positive sense of what faith is for. But as a liberatory reality, I think the right method of understanding how not to harm ourselves or others is to understand fully the Imago Dei. And so if I could, impart on anybody a single theological construct that would be helpful for them through a deconstruction process, it would be, how is it that I can understand others as Imago Dei?
Yeah.
And, being made in the image of God is the way that Jesus said we can reduce everything to just this. Like, that's the golden rule sum. If we can really love others, if we can see, what David Brooks and Thomas Merton saw was the image of God in everybody, and if we can just treat them all like they really have the image of God in them, then the potential harm that we do to ourselves and others is lessened, and we can work through. I don't worry about the license as much if people have a sense of the other as being truly
and
made image.
There's a sense when somebody breaks free, they're going to figure things out.
and they're going to mess it up.
They're going to make a choice that's unhealthy, and then they're going to it's an
inevitable part of growth.
So I have friends that have shifted from fundamentalist to like super liberal, and they've had some hard things that they went through, but they needed to go through them. So one of the things that you brought up, you just said this in relationship to Laura Anderson's book, but the way that trauma does cloud our discernment. Just this past week, without sharing any details, I had a conversation with someone that I know whose past trauma put them in a bad place in terms of personal boundaries and where they were really unsafe. And they didn't see that. I mean, I knew about the situation. I saw it, but it wasn't something that they could discern until they were kind of reflecting back on what happened. And, so, I encourage kind of examine questions, but it's some of those things, they just color us, to so that we don't know what we're doing, and we think we're doing good when we might actually be doing harm to ourselves and others.
What Janine McGonaghy, I'm going to get her last name wrong. She has a book called Trauma in the Pews, and it riffs off of Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline.
Celebration,
yeah. And so her book is particularly about developmental trauma and the way that spiritual disciplines interact with developmental trauma. And so kind of lays out these are disciplines that are probably not good for people with developmental trauma. And these are disciplines that can be helpful for people with developmental trauma. And that kind of there are just people who have done work that we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. And so nothing is going to be perfect for everyone. But if we have, or working with people who have trauma, especially developmental trauma, because developmental trauma and adult trauma just often work differently, being able to draw on people who have done work like Janine has to help prepare people for areas where they spiritually may come to harm with normal, you just can't read Celebration of Discipline and expect that everything's going to work right. Because we're not all built that way. Like, our boundaries are messed up, our expectation, our understanding of what suffering is. And one of the things that I think is most helpful in her book is that she talks about the fact that many of the self-protective things that people who have been traumatized do are within Christian circles identified as sin. And they're not intended as sin. They're intended as protection. And if we label people's protection as sin, then we're just pushing them away from the church. And that insight for me was just really, really helpful to think about. If we're doing discernment and using sin too freely as a label, we can end up not understanding how and why people do what they do. And frankly, just push them away from Jesus when what they need to be doing is being drawn in and loved well.
I have not read that book, but it sounds fascinating, and I would look it up.
She would be a great interview on this, because that idea of practice in her, what she is talking about is the ways that as a survivor of developmental trauma and a person who worked within evangelical subculture for decades, the harm that she was doing to herself without realizing it was something that was important that we can learn from without having to replicate.
Right. And honestly, there's also, I'll just say this and segue to one of my final questions, but one of the things that the literature on discernment directs us to is to learn from others. And in the history, that was Holy Lives, but it's also, spiritual reading. And I would say, what are some resources that you would point people to if they wanted to learn more about discernment, as you and I are both learning about discernment? So
I always, I track my reading, and I pay attention to what I read. And so as I was reviewing my books this year, I realized that history and biography was by far my largest. So even though I'm reading about discernment intentionally, like history and biography is what I realized that I'm doing as part of that, without maybe being as explicit in my head as what I
Yeah.
thought. So read history and biography as a means to understand how other people have done discernment. I think other books, like I would say Hanna Anderson's is a great place to start, especially if you're evangelical. I think that she's writing to an evangelical audience, and that's a good place to start. If you wanted to get a little more technical, Timothy Gallagher's is a Catholic writer who writes about Ignatian discernment, and he has 12-ish books.
I haven't read all of them. I've read a couple of them.
Yeah. So I think that his discernment of the spirits is kind of the place where I would tell people to start.
Yeah, that's a good one.
A very short one that I just read a couple days ago that I, am now going to put close to the top of my list is Marlena Graves' book, Bearing God.
Yeah.
The short version of the book is that she was at her mother's funeral. The passage being read from the liturgy that day was Matthew 4, when Jesus was sleeping in the boat. And as she was imagining that, she wasn't one of the disciples and she wasn't Jesus, she was imagining herself as the boat. And so this is the central metaphor of the book, is that we are the boat that is bearing God to the world. And the longest chapter in the book is explicitly about discernment, but the book as a whole is about, spiritual formation and what it means to be a Christian. And it's short, 80-page, tightly written, great stories. It's just a perfect introduction to why discernment is important for the Christian life. So go get that.
Well, yeah, actually I have it, but I have not read it. So when I saw your review, I looked on Amazon and realized I have it on Kindle. So I'm like, ooh, I should read that.
Yeah.
There are books on discernment that I could also add to the mix, but I think, one other thing that I think is really helpful for discernment is reading good fiction. I mean, the most on the nose, the thing that I think of is Susan Howitch's series, the Mystic Pathways, Glittering Vices. And that's really interesting to me because, it's set in the Anglican Church, and it is a series about clergy that go off the rails. But the thing that is the saving grace for anybody that's going off the rails is the other part of the church that has the voices that they're suspicious of and don't want to listen to, but they have something for them. So, you have your mystics and you have your broad churchmen and you have, different
evangelicals.
Yeah. But it's sort of like the being able to heal yourself is to listen to the broader community. And so the books are all different, and I haven't read them all. I've read, I think 3 or 4 of them, but the
6th is the best.
Oh, well, I don't think I got there. So
I think there's a start that is good, and then it gets to 3 and 4. And that's where I think most people stop, because there's an arc to these where,
it's
good things happen. And then there's bad decision-making and discernment that happens. And then it goes back to good decision-making and discernment again. And I think a lot of people stop in the middle because that's when they get frustrated with the characters. But she wants to illustrate where not everything quite works. And then she goes back to that good discernment again at the end. And it's, the 6th is the best.
Okay. Well, yeah. So that's, I'll look forward to reading that. The other one that, I just, I've mentioned this one to you, but the Soul of Discernment, Elizabeth Liebert has written, a couple of books that have discernment in the title and other books on spiritual formation that they're all good. What I like about this one, as opposed to The Way of Discernment, is that it's really about social discernment. So a lot of times we think of discernment as personal, but like communities need to discern things too. And so it kind of unfolds the process for a broader community, and not necessarily, it could be individual discernment, but also awareness of the wider community and sociological forces, race, how people are interacting in a space. When I did my spiritual direction program, we used it as kind of the basis for a social discernment class that was really helpful in terms of thinking through the history of a place, and yet also being open to where the Spirit might be whispering something new. So with that, I'd just like to ask, is there any practices that nourish you for your work and for your life as well? It's like, what do you practice that keeps you on the path?
It's taken me 10 years to develop it to the point where it's habit now and not something that I'm really working on as much. But the Book of Common Prayer is like the thing that I just almost never not do. So morning and evening, and I almost always do it as a podcast, and not as a written thing. And my tradition is that in the mornings I get my kids to school, and then I sit down and have a cup of coffee and I listen to morning prayer. And in the evening, I put my kids to bed and maybe watch a show with my wife or something, but I walk my dog before I go to bed and listen to evening prayer. And that practice that has finally become, habit. And because I'm so resistant to, any structure, I'm highly resistant to structure. It took me a long time to get it to the point where I wasn't fighting it all the time, but that has gone back to being something that is really important for me now. And frankly, it's probably in part because we got a puppy who needs a lot of walking, like 3 or 4 miles a day just to be able to survive with her in the house. And so that walking required I do something, and that's partially what forced me into that practice of being regular about it in order to stop fighting it. But now I can't not do it. So
neat. If people wanted to connect with you and your work, where could we send them? Social media or your website?
I'm on Threads, and I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm active on Twitter and Threads more than I am on Blue Sky and Facebook. But all of them are Adam R. Shields, so you can get that. Go to Adam R. Shields, and then my book review blog is Bookwi.se. It's the Bookwi.se. So I'm using a Sweden's domain.
It's such a great website. So I love that you managed to do that. And then you also have spiritual direction site as well.
Yeah, my spiritual direction site is just spiritualdirector.com.
Yeah, another wow way to get that site. Well, thanks, Adam. This has been a really rich conversation. Lots to process, and you've kind of sent me also lots of places where I can dig deeper into the reality of discerning God's presence and God's direction in my life. So thank you.
Appreciate being able to think about it and put it down for my own processing. So.
Awesome.
I hope you found this discussion helpful. I listed a number of the resources that Adam and I mentioned in the show notes for the podcast. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, keep practicing.